the Alabama Aquarium at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the educators here at the Sea Lab. And this is Dr. Havalend Steinmuller. She's one of our research scientists. And today she's going to chat with us a little bit about sea level rise and how it impacts coastal ecosystems, how coastal ecosystems respond to that and other stressors. And I think she's also brought some show and tell. So with that, I'm going to let Dr. Steinmuller tell you a little bit about her work.
Awesome, thanks Mendel. I'm so glad to see all of you here today to hear about coastal environments and sea level rise. So like Mendel mentioned, I'm Dr. Havalend Steinmuller. I'm the head of the Coastal Biogeochemistry Lab here at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. And this is my lab manager, Katie Barnes, who's going to help us with some of the demonstrations that I have today. I'm also an assistant professor at the University of South Alabama in the Stokes School of Marine and Environmental Sciences. So I am, by trade, a coastal biogeochemist, which is a really fancy word for I like to play with mud quite a bit. I've made a career out of it. So I'm interested in how energy in the form of carbon and nutrients, usually nitrogen and phosphorus, move both within our coastal ecosystems and throughout our coastal ecosystems. So the places you can usually find me are the coastal landscape. And I work in a lot of different coastal environments because we have so many here in the really diverse Mobile Bay region. So everything from our biogenic habitats, which are oyster reefs, anything created by biota, all the way up the delta to our tidal freshwater forested wetlands. So everything from cypress all the way down to oyster reefs. But the places you can usually find me, my favorite places, are mangrove swamps and salt marshes. And I'm really interested in these habitats because of their ability to do things for us, for people. And those things that they do are called ecosystem services. So the ecosystem services that I am most interested in are nutrient cycling and carbon storage. So wetlands, like mangrove forests and tidal marshes, whether those are salt or fresh marshes, are really, really good at cycling nutrients and storing carbon. And that's because of a couple of different unique features of these systems. So first of all, they're wet, right? It's in the name, wetlands. So that overlying water column in these environments means that it limits decomposition. So decomposition is the process by which things decay, right? So if you drove down here today or you looked out at our wetlands outside, you can see that they're really, really productive. They've got a ton of plant material in them. If you drove down the bridge, which you all had to get here, you can see our juncus marshes or black needle rush. And so they have this really high biomass, but they end up dying off. And so as that die-off happens each year, seasonally, like the things in our gardens, that organic matter ends up on the soil surface. Because wetlands are wet, that limits decomposition. And so that means that all of that organic material, all of the nutrients within it, all of the energy that that represents is essentially stored within these wetland habitats. They're also really good for cycling nutrients. So because they're wet, they have this ability to store that organic matter, but they also have the ability to take up things like nitrogen and phosphorus. So down here at the edge of the Mobile Bay Delta, we have a lot of influx of fresh water and all of the things in that fresh water, whether it's sediment or nutrients, that come down to us on the island and the wetlands around. And those wetlands are able to take up those nutrients, take up that sediment, and store it safely within those soils. You might have heard wetlands referred to as kidneys because they function very similar to our kidneys. They filter out toxins, they filter out things that might not be good for the coastal environment and end up storing those things. So the questions that I ask in my lab are really about nutrient storage, nutrient transport, and the fate of our coastal carbon. So wetlands are storing all of this carbon, and the questions that I ask are really, what does that carbon look like? How much of it is there? Not all carbon is created equal. Some is easier to decompose, while some is harder to decompose. You can think of it like cookies versus celery. Given the choice, I'm always going to pick cookies. And the microbes are usually going to pick cookies as well, if cookies is much more easily digestible organic matter. So I'm interested in what that organic material, that carbon, looks like. But then our coastal wetlands are threatened by a variety of different stressors just based on where they are, right? They occupy this interface between terrestrial or upland zones and our marine or aquatic habitat. And as we see warming on our planet, as we see rising ocean levels, as we see rising seas, the wetlands themselves are threatened in terms of their extent. So my questions are about, where does all that carbon go? So wetlands have this ability to accrete vertically to kind of keep their pace with sea level. So as sea levels rise, most wetlands are able to kind of keep up, right? They're putting organic matter down, they're changing their elevation so that they're in the same kind of place in the tidal frame. So which wetlands are able to do that? That's another question that I ask. But then if sea level rise rates are high, sometimes those wetlands are going to have to migrate upslope, very similar to us as people. When our coastal environments are no longer habitable, we move further north. I didn't, I moved south, I live on an island, but be better than me. So our wetlands are migrating upslope, and then sometimes when the rates of sea level rise are so high, places like coastal Louisiana, we see these wetlands actually being completely converted to open water, and we lose that habitat entirely, which isn't good from a carbon perspective, a nutrient perspective, and what about all the things that live in these wetlands? We've erased their habitat. So my questions center on how wetlands are coping with sea level and what it's going to mean when we lose these carbon stores and how that might exacerbate changes to our global climate. So my questions are really centered around carbon, and so I have some demonstrations today to talk about how we actually measure carbon. It's not something that we can easily see except in soils. So a lot of my work has to do with carbon in soils. So I have 3 different soils that I'll pass around. One of them is sand. Not a lot of carbon in sand. There's not a lot of anything in sand in terms of nutrients. But you can touch it, you can see how it feels. I do a lot with grain size and how things are transported. The next is some sediments from the Middle Bay Lighthouse. So I went out with Dissel and grabbed some sediments from out there, and you can feel them, they're very clayey. So a different sediment type, not a lot of carbon. And then I have some from a wetland, and so you can look at it and see pieces of decaying plant material. It might smell a little bit like rotten eggs, that's that sulfate. And then you can tell that it's really dark, and that really dark color is a way that we can say that this is a very carbon-rich environment. But in order to get an actual number of carbon from these places, what I do is I set it on fire. So essentially we burn things, we combust them, and the difference of how much CO2 comes out is how we know how much carbon is in our coastal environments. I'm also interested in greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane and how they affect our planet. And so what I have here today that I'll demonstrate, hopefully if it's warmed up, is a Lycor trace gas analyzer. So basically I take this white cap out to the wetland with the gray part on my back, and I just place it on the soil. And within about 5 minutes, I have an idea of how much CO2 and methane is actually coming out of those soils into the atmosphere. Right?
So let's go back just a minute. You were talking about the carbon sequestration. That's kind of a term that scientists use for the carbon storage that Dr. Steinmuller described. And one of the reasons that we think of this as a beneficial process, beneficial to us, is because some of these processes pull carbon dioxide out of the air. And you know, if you think about the global warming, the greenhouse effect, carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases. And so, we're thinking in terms of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We've put a lot of human activities have put a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it causes a number of problems, including acid rain as well as global warming. And so these ecosystems that can store carbon, sequester, they draw it out of the atmosphere and store it in the ground. We think of those as providing a service to us. And I think, we have long thought of marshes, salt marshes and other wetlands as sort of filters, or you mentioned kidneys, like kidneys for the earth, and we've sort of thought of them as places that could naturally tolerate this kind of, abuse. So I think that, we're at the point where we may be starting to challenge that assumption. What are you observing?
So that's a great point. Marshes, just by nature of the ecosystem processes and functions that happen within them, can be really resilient, right? They have this ability to accrete material, change elevation. They can be really resilient to coastal change, but up until a point, right? So as we start to exacerbate how coastal systems are changing, within the context of climate change, they can respond well and respond well and respond well, and then after a while things are so rough or so dire that we end up losing them completely or changing how they operate. So as we eliminate space for coastal wetlands, for example, because human development is moving closer and closer to the coast, those marshes can be destroyed. Or they can try and migrate, but they aren't given the space. We call that coastal squeeze. So the processes and functions of a marsh can be erased from the environment or can be completely changed as that ecosystem shifts to something that might be a little bit more conducive to how we use the coastal environment as humans.
It used to be kind of a popular phrase or philosophy or mindset to think that the solution to pollution is dilution, where we put all of our pollutants into the water and, they get diluted, they get carried away from us towards someone else, but, we won't think about that. But we kind of learned that mindset, it was short-sighted. And so we may be coming to that point in thinking of our marshes as, a solution for filtering pollutants from runoff. So as well as drawing carbon from the atmosphere, they also are filters between the land and the sea. So runoff nutrients, runoff pollution often gets filtered through marshes before it goes out into the ocean. So you mentioned the coastal Louisiana, and something that's been observed in coastal Louisiana as kind of a compounding stress with sea level rise is sediment starvation. So Dr. Steinmuller mentioned that marshes, wetlands can often, they keep pace with sea level change. So if the sea level is rising a little bit, then they're accumulating sediment and rising. But in some places where rivers are dammed, there's not as much sediment moving to the coast. So some marshes are sediment starved.
Yep, so coastal Louisiana actually has a lot of different ways that they're trying to deal with this problem. But a lot of places along coastlines globally aren't receiving the same amount of sediment that they used to. And that's a really cool thing about soils, is we can take cores. So we essentially just drive a tube into the ground and pull up everything that was in it. And the core's depth becomes a proxy for time. So we can see how things looked at a different date, a different time, and so we can see how things have been changing throughout the time scale of us modifying our coastal habitats. So to deal with sediment starvation, there are a lot of different thoughts. We probably can't suggest that we blow the dams on the Mississippi River, because I don't think that would go over well with all of the people that live around the Mississippi River. And for context, I'm from coastal Louisiana. I'm not sure that I like that idea either. But coastal Louisiana has come up with the idea of coastal divergence. So diversions can take two different types. There are freshwater diversions, which simply divert the fresh water and the nutrients in the Mississippi River into the adjacent wetlands. Think of this as just a cut in the levee. So as we cut that levee, water is allowed to flow into the adjacent wetland systems and revitalize them that way. Sediment diversions are a little bit different. So it's a larger cut, it's deeper. And so the idea is that all of the sediment that's flowing down the Mississippi River, some portion of it can be caught and pushed out into these adjacent wetlands with fresh water and nutrients to try and revitalize these wetlands and allow them to start to try to keep pace with sea level, to try and accumulate organic and inorganic material to be able to subsist in our changing coastal landscape. And so there's a lot of debate about diversions in coastal Louisiana, but there are quite a few that have been implemented with some pretty amazing success in some cases.
And she also mentioned some of the different soil types that can be found in our area and that she brought with her. Do any of you garden, whether that's in the ground, raised beds, patio plants? So you might know that if you have sandy soil, you might need to amend your soil by doing what? Adding fertilizer, or we might use a different word for fertilizer. There's what are fertilizers? Nutrients, yeah, or sometimes they're organic matter. Compost. So if you've got sandy soil, often, not all sand is a silica sand. Our sand here is mostly silica, which is, you can think of it as tiny little ground rocks. And in fact, they're like tiny, tiny little ground crystals. So they don't, let's go through an imaginative scenario. So if you took that soil, the organic matter, organic rich soil, your potting soil, and then you took sand for comparison, and you put them, say, in a hanging basket, and then you watered both, what do you think you would see? What do you think you would see as a difference? The water would flow very quickly through the sand. So the sand itself, as a silica sand, does not have many nutrients that are beneficial to plants, to algae at the bottom of the food chain, and it doesn't hold water very well either. So if you think about adding that organic matter, it adds nutrients and it acts kind of like a sponge. So it holds water, and then that water can be, essentially like sucked out of that soil by the plants. So, that's a way that you could kind of think of these soil differences, in ways that might be more familiar to you than pulling them out of the bottom of Mobile Bay.
Yeah, and so when we talk about wetlands, when I do outreach with folks, one thing I hear a lot is that wetlands cause flooding. And that one I'm not sure is all that right. So when we talk about these ecosystem services that wetlands provide, one of the really important ones is how they're able to hold water. So if you think about a parking lot, we call that an impervious surface. But water will just roll right off of it after a rainfall event or storm surge or any sort of storm. Wetlands, on the other hand, can pull in some of that water and store it within the pore spaces between the sediment particles or organic matter particles. So that's another service that these wetlands provide, is they can help mitigate some of the effects that we might see from flooding. So they don't cause flooding, but they actually do the opposite. They're able to dampen storm surge, and they have what we call a high hydraulic loading capacity, which is a fancy word for they hold more water.
Yeah, so to elaborate on your point that they can absorb storm impact too. So if we are thinking about hurricanes and tropical storms, I mean, one way they do it is they absorb water. They're kind of soft ecosystems. So if you think of that softness and you compare that to hard, dry land or human infrastructure, imagine punching a pillow and then imagine punching a board. Which would be easier to break, to punch through? to break through a pillow or to break through a board with a punch. It'd be easier to break a board because that soft pillow kind of, it attenuates, it shifts the energy all around. Where with the hard structure, the board, it takes that impact and it doesn't move it very much. It takes it in the place where that impact lands. So that's one way that storms, can be dampened by marsh, by wetland. And storms, hurricanes or tropical storms, they get their energy from heat. And they store that heat energy in water. And when they start to pass over land and drop that water as rain, they start to lose their energy and they kind of quickly disintegrate. So that's why hurricanes, they pass over land and they start to fall apart the more they pass over land. And so if you have, as coastal Louisiana used to have extensive wetlands, and also generally people are not building in wetlands as they are. They do fill in those wetlands and build on them, but generally that would be mostly uninhabited by humans with their hard infrastructure land, a zone for those storms to pass over and kind of lose some of that energy before they get to the human towns and cities and infrastructure.
So the metric we use is we say if there's a mile of wetlands, that'll dampen storm surge by about a foot. So a foot might not seem like all that much, but I can attest that when it's the thing that's threatening your home, a foot feels like a lot. So 1 mile of wetland is just this enormous ability to protect our own coastal infrastructure and ourselves from the effects of storm surge, of hurricanes.
So you were relatively new to this area. What are you finding, or what are you currently working on here?
That's a great question. So I've only been at the Sea Lab for about a year. And so it's been a really interesting year because it's allowed me to really be adventurous. I can branch out and start to understand what environments Mobile and Mississippi Sound and this entire region has to offer in terms of wetlands. So if you drove down the bridge today, you saw those wide expanses of Juncus wetlands. And interestingly, not a lot has been done with Juncus wetlands because they don't look like this outside of the northern Gulf Coast. So we generally see them in much more fresh environments. They don't have that salinity tolerance, other places that they do here. So I've been asking questions about Juncus marshes and that salinity tolerance. I've done a lot with the Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve over in just barely in Mississippi, and asking questions about the effects of controlled burns on our sediment environments. I've worked with oyster reefs here to try and understand how oysters can trap sediment and filter out nutrients from the water column to store more carbon under those reefs. So trying to quantify how they can be storage metrics for inorganic and organic carbon. And then my bread and butter is really sea level rise. So I'm asking a lot of questions about marsh edge erosion. Katie is the lead on this project, and she's trying to disentangle how different geomorphologies, different shapes of coastlines might impact how much carbon is being lost from these marshes associated with rising sea levels and increased coastal erosion. So trying to kind of constrain carbon budgets within the region. And the really exciting thing about this area is there are so many different environments to work in. Everything from those lovely tidal freshwater forested wetlands that we see a little bit north, all the way down this gradient of salinity and tides to what we see in our backyard here. And the really cool thing about the Sea Lab is that if I want to sample a Juncus marsh, I have to walk a matter of steps.
Yeah, I was gonna go back to that point you made, like at the very beginning, about how many different kinds of ecosystems we have here within a very small, relatively small compared to a lot of places, physical area. We have incredible ecological diversity. So we've got salt marshes, we have brackish marshes, we have freshwater marshes, we have cypress swamps, bottomland hardwood swamps, which are swamps when you get a little bit of flooding, freshwater flooding. We've got beaches. We just have we have oyster reefs in the Mobile Bay estuary, the Mobile Delta. We just have incredible ecosystem diversity within a small area that is just within an hour or so drive.
Which is really, really compelling for the work that I do. It's very, very nice to be able to drive to my sites within an hour, and it allows me to ask even more questions, right? So we have ideas for experiments that we can run all night out in the marsh, which up until now seemed a little bit crazy. But if the marsh is right there, it's really exciting, and it gives us this ability to create more knowledge, to fill more knowledge gaps, and ask more interesting questions.
Marshes have to have, or do all marshes have like vegetation that grows, or is vegetation just a product of the rich soil?
That's a great question. So to be a marsh, it needs to have vegetation. If it's unvegetated, we generally call that a mudflat. It has different ecosystem services that it can provide, but it's still really important to the coastal zone. But to be a marsh and fit that definition, it needs to have vegetation. And marshes are actually different from swamps because swamps have trees and marshes don't. So if you're ever in doubt as to whether it's a marsh or a swamp, look up, and if you see a canopy, you're in a swamp.
But that's how we define it. So, I mean, we humans have defined marshes, swamps. Marshes are grassy wetlands, swamps are forested wetlands, or flooded forests. Then we have freshwater and saltwater marshes, freshwater and saltwater swamps. Dr. Steinmuller mentioned mangroves, so those are saltwater swamps. And then other kinds of wetlands would be bogs.
So when you say that when the water level, I guess, rises to where the marsh can't keep up, what does it turn into? Does it turn into a mudflat, or?
Another great question. In some instances, it can turn into a mudflat because all that vegetation dies. But that vegetation is what really keeps the soil matrix together, right? Think of all those roots that are kind of pervading the soil and act as kind of like netting or structure, scaffolding for the soil itself. So when those roots die off because you lose that ecosystem as the waters start to rise, nothing's really keeping that soil together. So it starts to be disarticulated, that's what we call it. It basically mixes itself up. And then it gets exported into the coastal zone. When it ends up in the coastal zone, you suddenly have this influx of nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, tons of things. And that can spark local hypoxia events. So places where we see really low oxygen can give us algal blooms, which aren't necessarily very good for the coast. So that fate of carbon associated with those rising seas and that entire conversion of the habitat to open water is a really big question. Where does it go? Does it go back up into the atmosphere? Does it get exported out into the ocean? We don't really have a great answer right now, and we don't really know how much we're losing.
So it sounds like most of you are not from the coast here. Many of you are visiting. But have any of you ever walked along a shoreline, a vegetated shoreline, and seen it kind of washing away, where you can see the exposed roots and mud? Okay, I see a lot of heads nodding. So if you look at that, it has like a peaked look to it. It looks like kind of like you can see the. You have a picture of that?
We have some to pass around.
So you can see that it's almost spongy. Where if you walk along the beach or a mud flat, a different kind of environment where you don't have that vegetation. Now what I'm talking about is where it's exposed. So it's exposed by erosion. so you can actually see that, what the plants are doing with the soil. But sometimes you might, but they're doing that in, when they're not exposed. That's just kind of like where you can see it. But if you walk along in the mud or the sand, you can also see that it's moving. It's just washing away. It just moves. It may be kind of part of a natural transport system, or that transport might be accelerated by human activities, but it moves. Whereas with the vegetation in the soil, it's holding it in place. So
we see a lot of erosion around here. So Mobile Bay is such a large, wide open space, is that wind can move along that space and can increase the wave intensity or the wave energy. So those more energetic waves are hitting our marsh platforms, and that can mean that as waters rise, the waves get higher, they're more energetic, and it physically scours out particles from the soil. So vegetation is a really great way to try and keep that soil in place. But my questions are more, I think I've got it. So this one is from the Middle Bay Lighthouse. So if
they're wet, they're not even dry samples.
You're encouraged to touch
she brought you some mud.
And Katie has some napkins if you want to get it off your hands, but it's really good for your skin, so you might not want to.
It's neat if you rub it on your hand, you can feel how smooth it is.
Yeah, so one of the hazards of my job is really good skin. No, I'm kidding. So this one is really, really clayey. So as particles are coming down the river, the ones that settle out fastest are the ones that are largest, so sands. But as we get further and further from the mouth of the river, we see clays start to settle out. So those are really fine-grained sediments. They don't necessarily hold a lot of carbon, but they can hold a lot of nutrients. So I'll pass this one around. Again, you're encouraged to touch it. Be brave. And then
if you've ever been to a spa,
clay facials are a thing.
Yeah.
Every now and then. Late in my life. No, I'm kidding.
Smell it too.
And if you smell them, they might smell a little bit like rotten eggs. Very fun smell. That's the product of microbial respiration. The microbes are trying to breathe, just like you or me. And so they produce a gas when they use specific chemical compounds to breathe, because they don't have access to oxygen. You and I have to breathe oxygen, it's non-negotiable, but the microbes sometimes have options, and so they can breathe in, or they can use sulfate for respiration, and the production of hydrogen sulfide gas is what happens under that process. So they kind of have this rotten egg smell. People tell me it doesn't smell great. To me, it smells like science. Ooh, very good question. So marshes, her question was, if marshes flood, why isn't the soil eroded away all the time? So marshes are kind of adapted to live within a place where they can receive some water. That's what I find so charming about them, is because they're places that have evolved to live in really, really harsh environments, right? It's salty, it's wet, it's hot in Alabama. So they're used to the tides, and the amount of water coming in with the tides isn't enough to really mess with that soil structure. But when we see a lot of waves, that physical wave energy, so if you think about in your bathtub, if you move back and forth, I don't necessarily think you should, but if you move back and forth, you create these really big waves, right? So those waves hitting the marsh platform are much more dangerous for the soil than just very slow filling up your bathtub and letting the water out. Does that answer your question? Awesome.
Years ago, I read an article in Southern Living magazine. This is my favorite article I've ever read in that magazine, and it was about pluff mud, which is what people in the low country area call marsh mud. And it was about the wonderful, nostalgic aroma of pluff mud and how it smells like going home.
I
for the writer.
Yes, absolutely. To me, it smells like home. Again, I'm from coastal Louisiana, but it also smells like science. I very often have people stop by my lab and wonder what on earth I'm doing because there are a lot of noises. I shake a lot of sediments. I dry a lot of sediments, which means that it's not necessarily a very lovely place to sit and smell. But it's the smell and the sounds of data collection, and to me that seems like progress.
So you had one that had the peat in it, one that had mud. Did you say you had a third one?
The third one is just sand.
Oh,
Sand
okay.
from Dauphin Island Beach out here before all of the beach renourishment projects began.
Can I grab those and like flash them at the camera?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I don't know how well you can see this, but this one has vegetation in it. This one is mud from the bottom of Mobile Bay, and then sand from Dauphin Island.
Very nice. Thank you.
Does anyone have any other questions?
So with the industrial facilities north of here that discharge wastewater and what have you into the river sedimentation from the south, does it have toxins or maybe that will show up in samples that you've got?
Very good question. Yes. So the question was about the industrial infrastructure that's north of here and how that might impact what we see in our soils or in our water. So a lot of the companies that work further north of here, kind of in that industrial zone, have treatment wetlands, which is really exciting because treatment wetlands are essentially man-made or created wetlands that are there to capitalize on that kidney property. So basically they have these wetlands that are specifically designed to take up nutrients, to take up any sort of toxins, heavy metals, things like that, so that what they discharge out into the bay or into the river or into our non-man-made wetlands kind of doesn't have all of those things that might be not so great for the environment. Others of them do discharge directly into the river or the bay as a whole. And any sort of discharge from companies like that has to meet the EPA guidelines for what they can discharge. So a lot of what I do is measuring nutrients in soils. I don't do a lot of heavy metal work, so I might have to follow up with you about that, but I don't see anything that's necessarily alarming. But it's very hard to disentangle the anthropogenic or the people influence from the natural wetlands themselves. But there are strict guidelines that they have to meet for discharge of wastewater. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
On the way in here, you're dumping rocks, the barges are building reefs.
Yes.
Are they a benefit to the marshes, or are they going to hurt them, or is it?
So that project is actually really interesting because it's designed to create marsh. So we will have a public lecture here in 2 weeks.
2 weeks from today.
About that restoration project, if you're sticking around. But essentially what that project is supposed to do is dampen wave energy, so it's no longer affecting the road, and create wetland, which is really exciting for folks like me who want to see how this is going to progress and what ecosystem services those wetlands are going to be able to provide.
For any of you who have been watching that, as you've been coming and going, it was puzzling to me for a while watching it, but what I found out about the project was after they started, they found that they needed to dredge channels for their barges to get in there close enough to deposit the breakwaters. So in addition to the breakwater structures, they also have piles of sediment where they've dug out channels, and that's going to go back in the water.
So that the big high dirt one is not?
The dirt one's going back in the water. The rock structure, breakwaters will stay. Yeah. There are any other questions? Thanks for joining us. For those who will be around this weekend, we are having our annual open house at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, the Discovery Day. It's the one day of the year where our research labs are open to the public. So a lot of people ask, when they come to the Alabama Aquarium, well, how do we go to the Sea Lab? Well, this is the Sea Lab. This is the public aquarium of the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. And generally, our research labs are not open for people to go into. Their workspaces. They have, experiments running, and it's just not public spaces. But on Discovery Day, a lot of our researchers open their labs and invite the public in to see what work they're doing and talk to them about, the work that they're doing here. So that is Saturday, and in addition to the research labs being open, we have free and reduced admission to the aquarium, and we also have a lot of activities that our education and outreach programs do, and some partner organizations that do similar work in our area come and set up booths.
Well, thank you all for your attention.